Hello, and welcome to this final session, which we've called Trade Wars. As you all know, a lot of us like the idea of testing scenarios, and one of the big functions of business, of course, is to formulate strategies and to test different scenarios and how they might work. Over the past few years, Coriolis has been working quite a lot in the area of geopolitics, and that informs the discussion that we've had today around sustainability as well. But what we've realised over a period of time is that in the area of trade, trade itself has become a tool of foreign policy. So we've started to talk about trade wars, governments have started to talk about trade wars, journalists have started to talk about trade wars. So we have started to look at how you scenario plan on the basis of a wargaming methodology. So it's with huge delight that I am going to discuss how we game trade, literally, and the role of trade gaming in understanding what might or might not happen in the future, or what's happening now even. Let me introduce to you Dr. David Banks, who is the Director of Wargaming at King's College, and he is in the War Studies Department. Davey, it's a very great pleasure to be talking to you. And I guess my first question is, why do we wargame?
Hello, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. So why do we wargame? I think, one of the ways you can think about wargaming. So I'm using the term wargaming, which is kind of the term of the art. But I think for people listening, they shouldn't think automatically it means war. I think the core thing here is it's some sort of idea of, we might use the term conflict simulation or serious gaming, right? There's lots of different terms, but the general term is wargaming. But the key idea here of wargaming is, I think broadly speaking, when it's talked about kind of as a tool, is we can think about it having one of three purposes, broadly speaking. I mean, all of these things are always apparent in all cases, but it's either for fun, it's for education, or it's for analysis. Now, each of those versions always have a bit of the others in them, but fun wargaming, that's any video game or commercial board game that you've ever played, right? That's a game where fundamentally the purpose of the game, we should hope, is that the designer wants you, the player, to have a good experience. And so that means that the emphasis of the design is going to be around certain things that maybe wouldn't matter for an educational or wouldn't matter for an analysis game. Most importantly here, balance, right? Balance is of crucial importance in an entertainment game. People want to feel like they have a fair shot. An education game, as the name suggests, is going to be some sort of game where the purpose of it is to train the players or give players a deeper understanding of something. So I use educational games in the classroom. And a big part of its use, not the only part of the use, is to give them experiential learning, right? So that they're learning about some sort of idea like bargaining or diplomatic negotiations or whatever it is. And now the game is an experience for them to have that experience synthetically and appreciate things that often seem quite obvious on paper. Diplomacy is a really good example of this. It often seems like something that's really obvious when you read a history book. Like, oh, why didn't they just negotiate that problem? It's so simple. And then you make them kind of play out something like it, and they actually realize those kinds of things are more tricky or contingent or complex than they are. And then the last reason is analysis, right? And so for analysis, which I suspect is what most people are thinking of when they're thinking of this much more serious wargaming, is for us to try to be able to understand a number of different things. And again, there's a bit of overlap here, but in principle, the kinds of things we can try to understand, most notably, the one that most wargaming professionals and academics, I think, are most comfortable talking about is decision analysis. Right, how actors make choices, how they respond to the choices of other actors, so we can analyze these decisions and try to get a sense of why people are making the kinds of choices that they are. But we can also use them to try to understand system dynamics to a certain degree, so how a lot of factors might come together and operate when they're all operating simultaneously. This is especially useful for studying, low frequency events, right? Things for which we have very poor or scanty evidence. For example, a nuclear conflict, which thankfully we haven't had a full nuclear conflict in human history, but we might be curious to see how that would develop. So that's the kind of thing you might build a scenario around. But also similarly, I think in the 21st century, I think part of the reason there's so much interesting in wargaming now in the policy world and increasingly in the professional world and the business world is because we recognize there's a whole bunch of dynamics some of which have kind of an old trajectory. We've been here before, right? Great power competition, trade wars. They're not completely new, but we also realize there are new components to it, much more complex supply chains, a mass media environment, social media, and we're kind of curious to know how these things might interact with each other. And so wargaming is a way of being able to generate synthetic data which is not great, but it's better than no data, right? And so what you're doing here then is you're playing with, well, it might work like this, and we might be able to see things developing along these kinds of ways.
Absolutely brilliant introduction to the whole area. And I mean, like anyone, I guess the memory of playing games and running scenarios in a war type conflict is risk. And so you're thinking about these things. And actually, the word fun might be dubious in this context. And I think how long those things have gone on in my family and how we've all wanted to end up killing each other. But I guess we often think of wargaming in a military context, don't we? So, I mean, the word war is the key thing here. And yet, I guess there are lots of other walks of life where we use the word war, like trade war, as you say, or tech war, or we've got a war on ESG, making things sustainable, or a war on terrorism. So are there lots of different contexts that we can apply that wargaming methodology to?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that would be very, very broad on this. And I think the answer is basically yes. I mean, there isn't a standard definition of what a war game is in the literature, but I think some of the unique features that for me are kind of things that we want to kind of consider as being repeated elements. And this to kind of get to your question is, firstly, it should involve human players. And it should involve more than one human player. No, that's not a necessary requirement, but typically it's going to involve at least one human player. So this is how we can distinguish it immediately from something like game theory or just straight simulations or agent-based modeling, is you have real human decision makers in the process. And that, for me, my definition would include the idea that they have to make choices and live with the consequences of their choices. So they have to at least play more than one turn of a game, right? They don't just get to move their pieces. The other player gets to move their pieces too, and then they have to live with that choice. And then there might be some other elements to it. But those first two there, so if we just assume two or more players, where they're going to be set up against some sort of red team. So you've got blue as the kind of players that you're playing, and then red as your opponent. Now, red might be the adjudicators, right? They might have set it up that you're just playing together against them, or you're on your own against them. But the key thing here is there's some sort of opponent or some sort of opposing force, and they're making choices with some sort of limited decision space, right? They can't make endless choices. And then they're having to deal with the consequences of those choices. Now, by that definition, it's insanely broad. And so there's really nothing that you can't, in that sense, then war game, right? You can do it for supply chains, if you want to redesign your organizational structure, responding to market dynamics, operational planning for war, right? Tactical planning, political military, crisis response. And I know that they even use it, for example, in medicine for training. So this is how you're going to react to a body going into shock or whatever it's going to be. So there's really kind of no limit. So what unifies it here for me is not subject matter. That's not the unifying component. It's those methodological priors, which is that you have human players or a player or players. They're making choices. They're living with the consequences of their choices in some sort of system. And then there's other points that we can talk more about. But that, to me, so in that sense, there's absolutely zero reason it can't be applied outside of the area of war.
So I mean, really interesting. How important is history in this context? So let's be in a situation like we're in at the moment, and a lot of the context of this event is around trade wars, the legacy of the last 5 years, Trump administration, Brexit, etc., has created a situation where we can say the world has come pretty close to an all-out trade war, and we're still talking today about a trade war between the UK and Europe if the Brexit negotiations suddenly fall apart again. But the other thing that's really important that we're living with at the moment is the consequences of 250 years of industrialization, where we haven't looked at the consequences of our actions and taken responsibility, perhaps in the way that we should have done. So we need strategies to be able to move forward now, which are suddenly looking very different because of the technology that we have available to us, because of the interdependency between players in the world. So a lot of the organizations struggling at the moment with how to understand the situation they're in, they actually don't know what their strategies are going to be in the future. So does wargaming help with that?
I think yes.
Or is it, rather than just informing, it's actually helping formulate as well as inform?
So I mean, the answer is both yes and no. right? As a classic academic response, but it is both yes and no. It's yes in that if you think your design is a reasonably good model of the thing you're interested in understanding, then it probably is going to be a useful guide. And that's especially true, I think, when it's a low data environment, right? It's a thing that you don't really have other data about. The game can be quite useful for generating this synthetic data. It can be potentially, it could potentially misdirect you, right? You might play a game and then you get some sort of outcome and then think, oh, that's what's actually going to happen on game day. Now, there's at least two potential problems here. One is the game is actually poorly modeled for whatever reason. And so what you've done is you've actually presented a distorted view of how things work, and the players play that distorted view and they use that as a guide, right? So to use your Risk analogy, right, for those of us who played Risk, that's really not how war works, right? And for those who have played Monopoly, that's not really how running real estate works. Yeah. But if that's the only thing you played, and then you had no other way of knowing anything about real estate except for Monopoly, you might go into the real estate market trying to apply the principles of Monopoly. You're actually now worse off than if you'd never gamed before. So that's one potential danger, is how good is the game? Is the game fit to the purpose for which it's supposed to be designed? The other issue is that even if that was true, right? So even if you had a game that you were confident or some sort of way you'd say, look, this is an accurate model of the thing we're looking at, there's also issues here of gaming is where things go off the equilibrium path, right? You might be getting an outcome in your game, which even though the system is working really kind of logically, is not actually necessarily reflective of the depth or the possibility of that game, right? It could have gone lots of other ways. Chess here is a really good example, right? Chess is a game with a very limited set of rules. It's very strict, right? There's very little wiggle about what you can do in a game. In fact, there's no wiggle, right? All the rules are completely clear. But you can go in any direction. And if you play, when I was taught chess, the person who taught me chess intentionally, for those of you who play chess, you're probably aware of this, but for you don't know, it's possible for white to put black in checkmate in 4 moves. And that's how I was taught chess, right? My opponent put me in checkmate in 4 moves to teach me that you can be put in checkmate in 4 moves in chess. Now, however, if that would be the only game of chess I played, I might walk away from that and think, oh, in the event of chess, you will lose in 4 moves. But in fact, of course, that's not how chess works, right? Chess is actually far more complicated than that if you actually have experience. So this is a long way of saying, with gaming, you have to be very careful because there's a lot of possibility of giving you a lot of useful stuff. But firstly, is the game a fair reflection of the thing you want to model or the thing you want to bring to the forefront of analysis? And then even if it is, have you played it enough times? Have you actually given it a fair shot to kind of at least look through some of those contingencies before you start reaching real conclusions?
So the issue is actually the game rather than the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like any method. And so, my position and the position of a lot of my colleagues at King's as we're trying to develop this more academically is, I have an interest in gaming, a personal interest in everything else, but really it's about just being able to establish some rigor behind the method. And so the method is only as good as the question you ask and the things you bring to that, right? So, there's no such thing as a great statistical output, right? It's only good if you've got the right variables going in and you've got the right theory informing the choice of those variables and you've got the right data going into that, right? And so you couldn't just say automatically it's always the right tool. It's what's the question you're asking, what's the data you're using, what are the alternate kinds of research you're doing that's complementing this. That then will help you know whether the game was good or bad. It's not just automatically going to be good or bad.
So I'm going to give you an example of where this might fit into the context of what we see every single day in terms of our clients in financial services. So they've got one very big problem at the moment, which is a geopolitical climate which has shifted over the last 2 or 3 years and become particularly acute in terms of relationships with China. And we've seen this, that China hasn't come to COP26. The relationship between the US and China has become very difficult, let's put it like that. But there is a sense in which the world cannot do without China, because China is a very large buyer, a very large seller, a very large provider of technology, but also in terms of the way in which we move our game forward in the future is also critical in terms of sustainability. So it's less a game of chess, perhaps. I'm not a brilliant chess player, but I mean, it's not a game of chess and more a game of Go. It's more a game of strategy. And how do you configure a game like that so that if you are working within a business context, you can understand what some of the outcomes are and make decisions accordingly?
So I think there's two ways you can do this, right? And so at least two ways. But so one way, and a way that's used very often in government and in the kind of broader professional wargaming sector, is you design games that actually have very loose designs. And so they're much more approximating something like Dungeons and Dragons, where you have a facilitator, or what the umpire, we often call it the white cell. And so the rules are very loose, but inside the white cell you have a lot of subject matter experts. And then you have a lot of players be subject matter experts. So what happens is they start making choices. The white cell occasionally adjudicates one way or another, or sort of says, okay, that's a little bit too unrealistic, or we've just consulted with our experts here and they say that wouldn't happen. But what you kind of get is you're going to get it's sort of a narrative starts to unfold of like, well, this is realistically how these things could happen, right? So here the game itself is very loose, and it's just a way of being able to capture dynamically expert opinion by making people compete, right? Because that's the payoff, right? The payoff is if you have players compete. The quote from the economist Thomas Schelling, who was a big fan of actual using war games and research, was, no person, no matter, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but no person, no matter how intelligent they are, can never think of the thing that didn't occur to them, right? And that's the value of gaming, right? Is that you can't, if you play a game of chess against yourself, you can't really surprise yourself. But when you play a game of chess against an opponent, 12 moves in, you're like, never saw this coming. And so that's so even with very loose rules, you can get that dynamic of red says, hey, we want to do this. The adjudicator says, okay, that's fine. I think it would be more like that, but go ahead. That's one version. The other version is you can have a more strictly scripted game, right? So this would be more like a video game where you have a clear set of rules. Now what would matter would be, I would contend, is that what you want to do there is you want to make sure that exactly what's informing that design is very explicit. So let's go back to your China example, right? So that first method that that problem you identified here, which is exactly what's the danger here. Is China really, breaking away from? Is it getting into a conflictual relationship with traditional trading partners, or is it actually going to be more trade, or is it somewhere in between? That first method I identified, that was known as seminar matrix wargaming, would sort of be a way of working that out, right? Well, let's see which way this goes. The alternative version is you could actually design the game the other way around, and you'd say, let's assume they are. Let's design the game and say we assume China is actually trying to be fundamentally is still trying to be an active participant member of the sort of, modern world order. Mm-hmm. Now let's play out that scenario and see how this goes. Or you could design it explicitly and say, let's design the game so that China is kind of standing between two positions. We're going to give them a set of conflicting objectives. Now let's see how this plays out. So you can sort of do it where you prime it to go in a certain direction, but you're still going to get interesting outcomes. Because if you sort of say, well, let's set China up as a revisionist, let's see what revisionism might look like. Is that going to turn into military activity, or is that going to turn into trade wars or very aggressive, Silk Road, One Belt, One Road type initiatives? It's still not clear what revisionism might shake out as, but you could design the game to intentionally up that ante and then play through that logic a little bit and say, okay, we've made them be super aggressive. That still doesn't tell us what will happen next. Let's pit them against blue and see what happens.
So, just taking that a little further, because obviously the situation in the Indo-Pacific and the shift to Indo-Pacific is actually quite interesting from a trade perspective, because what it does is it ties into the fundamental challenge, which is a lot of the Indo-Pacific, a lot of the trade agreements around that CPTPP, and a lot of the sort of broader strategic documentation that's coming out, national strategies that are coming out, are centered around the technology that's there. They're centered around the role of China, whether it's building a military capability or whether it's not building a military capability in the South China Sea, and so on. And so the reaction, assuming China, to take your example, is that China is going to build up its military because that's seen as aggressive. But in actual fact, the other way of playing it would be to say, well, this isn't about military at all. It's about the economic power that China has. So you'd be able to model through, presumably under that game, whether or not sending Germany or the UK sending destroyers out to the South China Sea or to the Indo-Pacific region was going to have an effect on how China then excluded, for example, the UK in trade agreements or impose some kind of penalty. Is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could have a game that would do that, right? Because I think one of the important things here, which I haven't mentioned, is, one of the, we mentioned before, one of the key things you're trying to look at here is decisions. And one of the useful ways of using games when you're actually using them as a method of analysis is before the players, when the players make their choice and say, this is what we're going to do, you often ask them for a decision rationale. Why are you doing this? Like, what's the logic here? What do you think is, what is motivating you? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think your opponent's going to do? Because it's always useful to ask people what they think about those things before they see the outcome of their choice, right? Because you'll very often write a new narrative when the things actually start shaking out a different way. But then that can be quite useful because you can sort of say, okay, we're gonna, we think that this is what's motivating China, and we think that this is why they make these kinds of choices. So let's see if we kind of like we'll sort of establish that's what they're doing, and let's see how the other side responds, and then see how they respond to those responses. I think, I'm not sure if that adequately answers your question, but that you can certainly look at those kinds of things. I think gaming here has the potential to answer lots of kinds of questions. It also it doesn't have the potential to answer all of these questions, right? Like any method, it has to be targeted. So I think if you kind of set up a game to say, hey, what's China going to do in the Indo-Pacific region over the next 20 years? I think it would be pretty hard to design a very effective game out of that. It certainly would be very hard to effect a very rigid game because it's such a big question, right? There's just way too much going on. You need to have lots of subject matter experts at every stage of this kind of acting as breaks and checks. But what you can do is you can ask a lot of much more specific and narrower questions. And from that, you can start to build out a better kind of analysis of what's going on. And so, one of the ways I would typically think that it's a good idea to use gaming, and certainly the way you see it being used in some places, is that it's just one part of a research strategy. It doesn't replace existing research strategies, it just complements them. So you could sort of say, our researchers are showing, we have regular kind of people doing qualitative work or studying particular areas, and they're saying that this is what's going on. Maybe we can model that and see what would happen, how that would start going down certain roads. And let's model it a few different ways. Let's kind of give the extreme version and let's give it the neutral version and kind of just work out some of the way those things might work. And what it could do is it could set up for those analysts, oh, okay, we never thought of that. Like maybe that's something we need to consider now before it comes down the road 5 years from now. But, I think sometimes some proponents of gaming kind of promise that it can sort of, predict the future, but the future is too complicated. Society is too complex. It's not going to cooperate.
Well, and I guess as well, I mean, there's something called human beings involved with all of this, which makes the future intrinsically difficult to predict. But the question I would have, you said it can be the data light. Now, in the financial services sector, we're all very keen on data. So what type of data points do you actually need if you're going to model something like that? I mean, let's make it a simpler game. What is the impact on resource allocation? So how am I as a business or a government going to allocate my people around the world if I think there's a likelihood of if not a military conflict, then something that might happen in the Indo-Pacific? China might decide to impose some kind of tariffs on certain types of goods. That's at the moment, it's that type of tactic that it's using. How good does the data have to be if I don't have subject experts in my game? How good does the data have to be? Or are we using this as a way of triggering our thought processes?
So yeah, I mean, it depends what you're trying to get out of it, right? So I think my general position on this would be the less subject matter experts you have in the game as it's being played, right? Either kind of in the umpiring cell, actively sort of making decisions on the fly, then you're building essentially a rigid game, right? A game where the rules are all sort of set up. Yeah. Then you need to make sure that the people who are at least putting the inputs into that game have got high levels of expertise. And my position here is they should actually be. It should be reflective, they should be able to justify why they made the game design choices that they did. Because like any model, right, a game, like any theory, it's a simplification of reality. So what you're mostly doing is you're leaving stuff out. You're not including things. No matter how complicated it gets, you're always leaving more things out than you're putting in. So you need to be able to really articulate, we've included this kind of data because we think that this is necessary to understand this fundamental kind of economic principle, or this fundamental principle of weaponized interdependence, or this fundamental principle of state power. And that's why we've included these variables. And that's why they're in this model. And this is why we've modeled them to operate like this. So you can never include everything, but I think it's useful to be able to really establish clearly what you do have in and why it's in there and why you left certain things out. Now, the other side of that is, of course, some things are easier to include, especially in a rigid game. Economic data is easier to include because its outputs are much more measurable, right? We can actually measure that one country has more money than another country, right? We can look at an exchange rate, we can see actual output, we can see that they made this many widgets this year and these new widgets are coming online. It is harder to model certain kinds of things, right? Modeling things like national mood or popular support. I mean, it's not that we can't, it's not that we're not aware of them. And I'm a political scientist by training, and obviously there's a large body of research that does this kind of stuff, but that's the kind of place where it does get a little bit thornier. And I think you'd want to be really clear about why you're including it. Or very often, again, it's really what's your game about. You're probably just as well off leaving it out and then just flagging that it's left out, right? So that the person knows they play this game. Hey, you've played a game. It's about economics. It's about war. We left out domestic politics, but don't you leave out domestic politics when you're thinking about what might happen in the future. I think that's a way around this. It's just this kind of being transparent about what's going in and what's going out and accepting the limits of the method.
It's the classic Economist Copout. You leave, if other things are equal, then this is the way something will play out. And if they're not,
Yeah.
then things end up very different. So, I mean, I guess, and I would encourage other people in the audience to chip in with questions and everything in the chat or through whatever means by raising your hand, because this is super interesting and relevant to the sector, because at the moment, the biggest game is emerging through COP26. Okay, so we've got a political game going on where politicians are trying to convince their publics that they're actually doing something for climate change. Meanwhile, the industrial sector and the business sector is in a position where the very simple objective truth is that soon this will become regulated in a far tighter way than it has been. So a lot of the conditions around managing supply chains or dealing with certain types of product, like we've seen with coal or methane, that's going to become regulated. So strategies have to change. So can you model in a war game where you know the endpoint? And the endpoint is where you're going to get to a point where you're more regulated because of the way these decisions are going. Can you work out a decision tree on the way, or am I just talking about decision trees rather than games at this point?
Well, I think the difference here, if I'm understanding the question right, I think the difference here between a decision tree and a game would be that what you could do, in a decision tree, you could sort of think, okay, here's the organization that, coal or whatever it is, that realizes regulation is coming down the road. Let's imagine all the kinds of moves they might make going down the road, depending on what the other team does. I think the advantage of a game here is you could think, okay, what do you think the drivers of these changes are going to be? What do you think is really going to be pushing these things forward? How much do we think they're going to be active participants? Are they going to be agents in participating in change? And how much do we think they're going to be structural dynamics that are surrounding agents? And then the ones you think are agents. So do you think that, for example, the kind of, there's obviously large public interest in sustainability, but is there a point where that's actually going to turn into like a fundamental political expression, like a political party that really represents that as a clear number one voting issue and starts gaining real leverage? Well, then you might want to build a game where that's a player, right? So you're going to put that in as a player. And then you're going to put in the fossil fuel industry as a player. And you're going to put in these kind of on the fence, kind of want to have it both ways, a lot of modern governments as another player. And then you see how they strategize against one another, right? You let them generate the decision tree rather than you trying to think ahead of time. And I think this is where the potential benefit, or at least it is the genuine methodological difference, I think, here between things like game theory and even ABM and simulation, is that they're going to start thinking of things which will surprise you and surprise themselves. And they'll be surprised themselves at the choice they make on turn 3, because they would have never got there except that these other players kept doing stuff and they had to get creative about their response. And so I think what you could get out of a game like this is you could get potential idea of the types of strategies these actors are going to select. So that if you're one of these actors and you're worried about these opposing actors in this political arena, you could say, well, let's game it out and let's get ready for what we think the kinds of things are that they will say. Think about the types of forums that they will try to meet us in or that kind of thing. None of it may happen in reality, but it can at least get you tuned into the potential range of types of things that can occur. I think that's where you get one of the kind of potential payoffs. So, the risk would be you play the game and you develop your strategy out of the game, but it wouldn't be a totally terrible idea to play a game. The famous example that wargamers love to go back to because it's so vindicating of the method, but the one that it's kind of it's like a, I don't know. I mean, it's not apocryphal, but it's just one of the classic stories is that in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the U.S. Navy engaged in a number of these simulation games. They did what were known as chart games, where they kind of mapped out the whole world, and they did maneuver games where they mapped out actual unit engagements. And they ran hundreds of these. They had one against the UK called Navy Plan Red. They had one against Germany called Navy Plan Black. But their very famous one is the one they ran against Japan called Navy Plan Orange. Now, they ran this game over 100 times. And at the start of when they first started running this game, they had a particular doctrine of battle fleet engagement, a particular way they thought that ships would engage. And the more they played the game, of course, the more the Japanese player wouldn't engage on those terms, right? Because it was completely useless. Japan's like, we're not going to fight your battleships, we'll just lose. So they would engage in essentially carrier warfare. Over the course of playing that game hundreds of times, the US Navy developed the island hopping strategy that they actually used in World War II. And the very famous quote from Admiral Nimitz, who was the head of the US Navy in the Pacific, was that nothing the Japanese did to the US was something they hadn't already done to themselves in their war games, except for kamikazes. That was the only thing they hadn't thought of. So they'd played this game out so many times and tested their own strategies. Instead of sort of saying, oh, this will work, make the opponent test it. And of course, Japan would just not play naval warfare the way the US wanted them to play. And so the US Navy realized, well, we're going to have to change. They're not going to change. They're going to try to wriggle out of this. So we should be ready for that on the first day.
So back to the China example, this is absolutely classically about understanding the behavior of your opponent, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's all about nudge theory and behavior theory in a modern context. It's all about how we manage to understand the position of the other person, which in trade terms, I think we've probably hugely miscalculated over the last 5 years. We didn't realize that China would actually be quite upset by the fact that it had tariffs imposed on it, and that it might, as we started to get more belligerent about our rhetoric towards China, that China would actually be offended by that and feel as though there was a need to retaliate in economic terms and to launch its things like internal circulation, where it becomes more dependent on itself and its Belt and Road, rather than external circulation, which is its trade with everywhere else. So if we'd gained that at that point, would we have been able to understand that potential outcome, do you think?
I think potentially. So I think potentially, I mean, I wouldn't want to say yes. I think potentially the reasons that game, so instead of saying yes, what happened, I can try to think about the reasons that gaming could have got you closer to spotting that problem. One of them is that the game makes the player represent that side. So instead of you kind of creating oh, I bet they do this, I bet they do that, and China would never do this, you make another team beat China. And so you let them make the choice instead of you just kind of creating a caricature in your mind of your opponent. Now, of course, those players are going to bring in all their own biases. This is why you always get this argument. It's useful to have subject matter experts, because they'll say, well, I wouldn't do this, but I think the Chinese regime would do this. But the point is here is someone else is making these choices, and they're actually making the choices rather than you saying, well, I think they'd most likely do this. You get to see what they'll actually do in these games, especially if you iterate it a few times. That's useful, right? You get to see all the variations. That's one component. The other component here, so that's what the method would add. The other thing that it adds, a lot of proponents of gaming, and I certainly recognize that it exists, exactly what we do, we're not sure, but the immersive side of gaming is considered one of its great benefits, right? Is that by playing it rather than kind of talking about it. So if you get people in a room or you get them in front of a machine and you've set it up all right and they've got the cards and like you're this team and you're that team. My experience with doing this with students, advanced graduate students, as well as, at every stage basically, is that they'll start to inhabit the role, right? And they'll start kind of go, well, I think that's what they do. I just ran a game on Wednesday where, it was China and US and North Korea and all these things, and people were really getting into it. And so there's the combination of immersion and actually making them make choices at least gives you the possibility of them being more dynamic and more really trying to reflect at least what they think China's interests are, rather than just somebody saying, well, you wouldn't care about that. They could sort of creatively say, well, we are insulted by this. And, this we would find, so that would be why gaming could have potentially created those kinds of insights. I'm not saying it would have in any particular iteration, but at least it's those mechanisms of the competition and the immersion that make a lot of proponents of gaming think that under the right conditions, if it's conducted correctly, you get essentially external validity, right? It's a better representation of what you think would happen in reality than just, kind of guessing, or not guessing, but educated analysis.
I think it's really interesting. I have another question, but just again to reiterate to the audience, there's a question coming through here from someone who's saying, in your experience, when running through wargaming scenarios with executives and students, do they play to win, knowing it's a game, or do they play to achieve mutual benefits with all players on all sides? How realistic is it?
No, it's a very good question, right? So, I mean, again, part of it is design. So if the game is designed to be really conflictual, they'll play to win because that's the way the game is designed. If the game has a cooperative component, either intentional or accidental, they might just cooperate more. But generally speaking, they play to win. And so to kind of answer your question, like that's what, and that's, this is considered the payoff of the game, right? Is that they will come in and they will try to win. Although I'm currently doing research that, in fact, most cognitive science shows us that most people play to avoid losing, as opposed to play to win, which is a slightly different motivation. But so they do play to win. Now, how you control this is where the role of facilitation and the white cell is important, right? So it's either going to happen in the time the game is being played, or it's going to be built into your design. You'll find a way of folding it into design to make sure they can't collaborate unrealistically. As I said, we played this game last week on the red team. It was US and NATO versus China, DPRK, or North Korea, Iran, and Russia. Now, all the red players had their own objectives, but at one point they all started collaborating and chatting together. And myself and the other facilitators had to intervene and say, look, you guys aren't on the same team. You're your own countries. So we had to kind of nudge them back to, try to play in your role a little bit more than you are. And then they did. Then they kind of stopped doing this kind of ridiculous level of collaboration. And well, it wasn't ridiculous, but they were being too enthusiastically collaborative. So that's the important role that adjudication and the white cell and fundamentally the game design play, right? You've got to be kind of conscious of these things ahead of time, which is why, as I've said, I think a good game should be based in something more than just design preference. It should be based on, existing scholarship in these areas. What do we know about these places? What do we know the actual tensions are in these relationships? Okay, let's try to make sure we fold that into the design so that players will kind of slightly naturally find these limits themselves in the absence of subject matter experts.
Thank you. And do keep the questions rolling through. I think my corollary question to that would be, certainly in the area of sustainability, where, I'd say there is an element of governments taking control of supply chains a long way down the line, in order to exclude certain things like human rights abuses and labour market practices that aren't very nice, or modern slavery and things like that, for quite legitimate reasons for doing it. But ultimately, in the end, there is something very different in the sustainability agenda as a gamed outcome, because it is a mutualistic one, isn't it? Or even a symbiotic one. It's one that we have to start playing together. So it's one of those strategy games, emerging strategy games, where actually everyone ends up on the same side. It's sort of a more there are games like that are beginning to come out that you need to understand. It's like playing bridge, but knowing somebody else's hand all the time.
Yes, and I think what's interesting, what gaming here can do is something that's a little bit different than analysis, right? But it can give you this kind of experiential learning. I played a game recently that was designed by a researcher who was working on climate and security, and he wanted to use gaming. And so, it's in its early stages, but the core idea of the game was that after a few turns, all the choices you made earlier, all the negative downsides of your choices, the chickens come home to roost. Now, the problem with the way the game is set up is, every turn you can set aside some of your resources to try to deal with these problems down the line, or you can, do the thing you're trying to do right now. And so, of course, most of the players are like, yeah, okay, I know I need to save up for the winter, but I'll make these choices now. We'll worry about that later. What happens then is, near the tail end of the game, in the last sort of third of the game, it just goes insane. And the crises that you kept putting off suddenly become much more acute and much more systematic and frequent, and it's too late. Now, what the game here is, at that point, essentially, you can't win. But what the game is showing you is, you think you can keep putting this on the long finger, but in fact, it is going to catch up with you. There is a way of solving this problem. You've just got to do it earlier. And so that's a good example of how a game can show that, right? Because obviously with sustainability and the climate, we're all in this together, but it's also a classic tragedy of the commons, right? Where at that immediate moment, the temptation to buy a plastic bottle or get on a flight is hard to, it's hard to fight that temptation for you, even though you want everyone else to do it. So games can give insights into that. They can give you a sense of how that. Also, other games are designed, and there's commercial games that do this as well, but also non-commercial games. Just about the complexity of collaboration. That even if you all agree you want to work together, so even if that's even built into your game, that itself can be difficult. And that can be useful just to show you how those trade-offs are very hard to make, even when you're all on the same team and you're all working together.
Witness two things. I mean, I played a game at Christmas and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it, but where you're standing on islands and rocks and the things just disintegrate underneath you unless you make your moves correctly, and you have to make those moves collaboratively, because if you don't, then you all end up on different bits of rocks all stranded in the ocean and they collapse on you. So I mean, that to me is the ultimate doomsday sustainability game, isn't it? Because we're all standing on rocks and the islands are collapsing underneath us, and unless we work together and jump about between islands and pull together, we're not actually going to be able to create enough rock for ourselves to stand on. So maybe the gaming idea needs to adapt to some extent, and maybe there's a way in which some of the challenges that we're facing in financial services can actually inform those types of games as they start to develop. There's another question coming through here. Any suggestions for good commercial examples of war games that are still balanced but have good learning and analytical outcomes?
Good learning. So, I mean, you'll have to give me a second as I quickly do a quick run through my brain of what I think.
Database search.
Yeah, a quick database search of some good games. I mean, it kind of, it's how long is a piece of string? What are you looking for, really, is the question. But I think, there's some interesting games out there, commercial games that can give you insights into different things. There's a good, let me think. Well, there's a very fun economic game called Panic on Wall Street, which is just really good about how complex markets are, because you have two different kinds of players, renters and then something else, but they're basically working in different markets, but you're just kind of busy trying to get rich, and then without knowing it, there's this whole market dynamic going on of buying and trading and everything. So that's a very fun economic game. I think a good war game that's kind of got a lot of historical flavor and is pretty accessible is a game called Quartermaster General World War II. So it's quick, it's about 2.5 hours. It's teams, so it's one team versus the other team, but it's World War II in 2.5 hours, and it's got a good bit of history and stuff. So that's a fun one. That's one I could recommend.
Just another question coming through. So the person who asked the question says thanks, but another question coming through now. Are the tech giants working in this space? So we see Google and IBM working on chess and Go and similar games. Who's leading the way on scenario planning games in the digital space?
I'm not sure who's leading this. It is still mostly something, as far as I can tell, that works much more in the governmental space. I know that some of the consultancies like Deloitte and McKinsey and places like this have dedicated wargaming departments. But I think, in terms of the ones that are reaching government more, I mean, RAND is an organization that does a lot of gaming in this, as an organization, as opposed to just individual scholars. There are a lot of individuals who are working on their own individual games that have a lot of application. But I think, I'm not sure how much these tech giants are working in this space. And I will also, bracket everything I'm saying in that the method has been around for a very long time. But this kind of new focus on kind of scrutiny and rigor is reasonably recent. And that's not to take away from all the achievements of previous workers and designers in this area. But I think, especially as academics in the last decade have got more into this area, it's not that we do better work. That's not what I'm going to claim. But it's just that, we're tuned into a different set of priorities. And so for academics, we want the knowledge to be replicable. We want to have systematic standards. And once you start getting that kind of component into it, it creates a different type of issue about what games need to do. And this is why I'm kind of always using this language of like what it can do and what it can't do. It's slightly different when it's led from the other side. But I'm not really sure what these big organizations are doing. I'm sure they're doing a lot of red teaming of some kind, but with like any method, it's how good you've set that up. What's the question you've asked? Have you got the right data? Have you got the right design? There's no such thing as bad, good, statistics is not automatically good or bad. It's any particular model has to be evaluated on its own terms. So there's no guarantee that it's either good or bad.
So one other question, how does knowing when the game will end affect how players will act? So if you know you've got 5 rounds, if that's all you've got, then that's going to affect the way you've got. Whereas a lot of the scenarios that we might be building, we are, as you know, building a game called Primacy, which is basically a trade war game. Those scenarios are open-ended. So it's a bit like the Bake-Off challenge. You've got 4.5 hours to produce a showstopper. So it alters what you're going to cook. You're not going to cook something which is sourdough and takes 3 days. So to some extent, does creating a stylized game actually alter the way in which you play it?
Yeah, no, 100%. It's a really good question. It's a known problem, but the solution to it is not clear. But absolutely, people, when they know a game is ending, they will start throwing, as they say in America, Hail Mary passes, right? It's the end of the game. You've got one last chance. And I know when I run games with students and whatever, they feel the game coming to an end, and they'll start making choices that they probably wouldn't make, those things they're representing. And this gets to the question that somebody asked earlier about, are they playing to win, right? It's both the blessing and the curse of the method. Because they're playing to win, they're playing aggressively and creatively, and they're coming up with strategies and things you wouldn't have thought of. The downside is they're playing to win. And so now they're going to start doing things near the end, which are unrealistic. One way of getting around this is to well, a very good way, which is what you guys is to not, the game doesn't end, right? Because if the game doesn't end, then there's no point where you can say we spiked the ball and it's all over, right? It's not going to end at minute 90. It just keeps going. So that dilutes that behavior. The other way is you can try to build into the game that the players don't know when it ends. So you might know where it ends, but they don't know it ends, because then that won't affect their behavior. I used to run a game over a whole semester when I was back in the United States, and it was 14 weeks long, but I told the students this will end sometime between 8 and 14 weeks. So they wouldn't know once they got past week 8, well, is this the final week of the game, or do we have 5 more weeks? And that meant that they would not be doing, really risky things, because they weren't sure, well, if we take a huge risk on turn 8, we'll be living with the consequences for 4 weeks. So you can definitely adjust it, but yes, that's a well-known problem. Like that kind of last-minute panic is real.
So I guess in terms of the war gaming and the gaming sort of scenarios that we might build, because they're perpetual, we're talking more Dungeons and Dragons than we are Snap at the moment. It's more of a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons type approach. So someone else is asking here, does depending over much on AI technology and data block the human ability to discern and use gut instinct? So I mean, your games are actually to a large extent built on the gut instinct side of things, aren't they? They're physical games. But if there were a move to put more emphasis on AI and machine learning to simulate outcomes of games, would that block the experience of the human?
So I think it's where you put the AI. But I think you put the AI in the decision-making set. If it's actually making the decisions, I mean, it's not going to give you, I think, it's not going to give you as many interesting insights. Might give you general kind of patterns of behavior, right? This is kind of how agent-based modeling works. But, for anyone who's ever, it's the difference between playing a game of chess against the computer and playing a game of chess against an opponent. Because very often human beings are going to do things which are strategically suboptimal, or, that aren't necessarily immediately obvious what the payoff of that will be. And so you'll often get this kind of play which is not being constantly optimized because humans can't do it. Also, they'll behave emotionally. I think you lose a lot. I think that for me, the definition of wargaming as a method is you must have human players somewhere in that decision space. And once you take them out, you're talking about a different method. I think the other side of this, though, is of course you can digitize a lot of it and you can automate a lot of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because obviously it allows you to do a lot more stuff, right? Analog board games or whatever, they're long and they can be very hard to adjudicate, and they're slow. What you lose from it potentially is that if there's a lot of stuff happening under the hood, the players may not understand why their choices are cashing out the way they do, and so So you know, it's useful then to make sure that even if, you know, if it's electronic or it's automated, that I would contend it's useful for the players to know how the automation, broadly speaking, works. Obviously, you can't give them a blow-by-blow account, but that they actually do have a sense of this is the fundamental algorithm that the game is working on, right? Because every game is an algorithm, right? You know, the rule book of Monopoly is just if this, then this. It's just an algorithm. It's just written in English rather than in math. But I think it's useful for the players to know that, especially in terms of analysis, because then they can identify, okay, well, you left out something that I think is really important. Doesn't mean the game is bad. It just means, you know, they've left that out. And so that you can go, okay, this game does not capture this important dynamic that I think matters, but still we can use the game. But caveat, it doesn't tell us about whatever inter-party politics. So whatever our subsequent analysis is going to be, we're going to have to get that from somewhere else. I think when games don't reveal that, then you don't have a sense of which is the bit that's you know, what's being left out, right? You need to know what's being left out. And that's true of like a statistical output, right? When you read a statistical output, you can see all the variables. You can tell what the author left out, and you can say, okay, well, they didn't account for that. Now I know that.
So there's another question coming through now on the time left to play and how this affects choices. I assume changes in the choices could be reflective of the quick action required as the pressure to act increases. For example, climate change has an ambiguous endpoint where it's too late to take action and have a meaningful impact, but we don't know accurately what that is. One scenario game that captures this is Fate of the World 2011. Do you think
I'm not aware of this game? I should probably be aware of this game, but I'm not aware of this game. I am. Yeah, I know. I think it's a good point. I think there's two things here to recognize. One is that I think traditionally, if people know the game is ending, you have this shadow of the future problem, where as they know it's ending, the game is a terminal thing, right? So they're like, in this game, I want to get the result. So I think if they know the turn tracker is coming to the final turn, what's causing the major change of behavior is not just reflective of different you know, the stress of making choices quickly. It's the stress of the game ending. However, the questioner did bring up another interesting point, which is there's a different set of stresses, which can be the stresses of making choices quickly. And again, that's something that I would think that if you're designing a game, you'd want to know whether or not you want to include that. So if you had a game in which you don't think decisions are made under stress, you don't want to have that be part of the game, because what you might be getting results that are distorted, because what's really happening is because people only have 30 seconds to make a choice and they're just going to click whatever they have. However, if that's what you do want to model, then that's exactly what you can put into the game. You can say, you've got to make your choice in 2 minutes. And usually when I've done this with students, like, well, I don't have enough time to actually make the choice. I'm scattering. I'll choose this, which is actually very reflective of crisis decision making, right? Crisis decision making is, I have a limited amount of time to process a limited amount of information and pull a trigger and hope that I've made the right choice. So again, it's the kind of relentless point out mantra I always come back to, is what is the game for? What is the game for? That determines what you include. It determines what you leave out.
I'm very conscious of time now, and the questions have been fantastic. This is a super fascinating one. The different cultures approach games in different ways. Do you see much variation in regional and national approaches? I mean, you know, the sort of strategic culture type question, which is absolutely colossal. People have written huge books on this, so you have 1 minute to speak without repetition, hesitation, deviation.
So, I mean, I'm not aware of any systematic study on this in the wargaming world. I do know there's anecdotal stories of this. I know there's a large multiplayer online game. Well, I could say the game. It's called DayZ, where you're basically living in a zombie apocalypse. I won't name the countries. I do know that when it was released from country to country on different servers. And in one country, when it was there, everyone was actually quite cooperative and they were working together. You know, they'd meet a stranger and they'd say, hey, I'll share with you my food and my weapons or whatever, and let's go fight the zombies together. Then it went to another country. They opened servers in that country. And in that country, it very quickly turned into essentially a mass murder game, where as soon as you saw a stranger on the horizon, you shot them and you stole all their stuff. And the whole game plunged into complete anarchy. That was a good natural experiment, because the game was the same each time. The only thing that changed was the culture. It was in country A, everyone's cooperating. They moved it to country B, they opened servers there, and suddenly you got a race to the bottom. So there's certainly there's anecdotal non kind of, it hasn't been done as an experimental, you know, an official experiments, but we know there's a lot of data that supports those kinds of ideas.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I am going to ask you to wrap this up in a second, but I would just comment that that's intrinsic to the human condition, that the same same text or the same book put in front of different people will be read in different ways. And I mean, you know, they'll never forget the weaponisation of trade was taken up by the Trump administration. If he'd read it carefully, or how we'd intended it to be written, it wouldn't have been taken up by the Trump administration. He'd have thrown it in the dustbin, because he'd have said, you're being really critical of how the US is playing this particular game. But in fact, they interpreted it as trade is being weaponized, we need to do something about it. And so it's exactly the same text but interpreted in different ways. So I mean, I'm guessing that would be that would be an element to consider. There's one last question. I think we've just about got time for this. So this question is, Nicholas Wright has worked on strategic culture from a neurological perspective. He carried out a study with the US and Chinese children and found that different areas of the brain lit up when given different tasks, including games.
Yeah, no, this is not an area that I study closely. I do know there's a book called Geography of Thought, which is a sort of it's quite old now. I read it about 10, 15 years ago, but it was essentially a summary of all these noticeable differences in different parts of the world about how various people interpret information and make decisions. But I'm sure there's probably something there for sure.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I'm going to ask you to summarize all of this. In a year's time, if we had developed a game that was coping with, let's say, climate change and understanding how we need to game some of these things, what are we going to be talking about as the key elements of it?
In that design feature? Well, I think I think it's you have to know what it is you're trying to get out of it as the designer. So if you're designing a game and you think that climate change has the following components, it's fundamentally a problem of these kinds of things, then it's just crucial that that's in the design. A lot of people, and I think I'm basically one of them, buy into some version of tragedy of the commons type explanation. So you'd want to have that be part of the design feature. If you're not quite sure what you think all of these things are, that's a good argument for those more open types of gaming structures where you bring in experts and you have them kind of pit against one another, and experts in the white cells to kind of see, well, actually, which are these dynamics? How do they seem to operate together? So, I mean, it's the kind of classic response over and over, but it's the one I always say in my classroom is, what's the game for? You can't just sort of say, we're going to do a game on climate change. The question has to be, we have a particular question we want to ask. Is the game the right method for this? And then if so, how do we design that game? Just like every other method that we use in social science.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm getting feedback for this session that I haven't had in the other sessions, which is everybody's saying truly insightful, absolutely excellent. Thank you very much, David. How intriguing it's been. So thank you very, very much indeed for a wonderful hour. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I hope we can do so on many more occasions in the future. Thank you.
Lovely talking to you all, and thank you for the questions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.